Good evening. I'm Ward Ulmer, president of Walden University, and I'm so glad you're here with us this evening for our historical perspective on equity in education. Walden University was founded on a mission of access. 50 years ago, two teachers created this university so that working professionals could advance their education. Many of our first students were educators who wanted to complete a doctorate so that they could make their schools and their communities a better place for everyone. And as part of our 50th anniversary, we're continuing this commitment with the series of virtual panels that we call Talks for Good. We believe a good education is one that challenges the status quo and develops advocates, visionaries, and innovative leaders. At Walden University, we believe a good education is an education for good. And ensuring that all students receive a quality education that fulfills their potential is important to all of us, especially our educators, our school service providers, and our policymakers. Tonight, we're discussing equity in education through a historical lens, because to move forward, we have to learn from the past. We have experts with us who will shed light on the issue and bring light to the solutions. I hope that you gain additional perspective that helps you affect change in your schools and in your communities. Now, I'm very excited to introduce our moderator for this evening, Mikel Oliver. Education is her life's calling. She's the owner and principal consultant of Mpact Consultancy. Here she supports mission-driven individuals and initiatives. Mikel began her career in public education 13 years ago as a fourth grade teacher. And since then, she's worked as an instructional coach for K-5 mathematics and as managing director of the Boys Institute, an initiative she founded in 2016 for Black males in Southeast Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us tonight, Mikel, to guide this very important discussion.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Ulmer. Hello, everyone. I'm Mikel Oliver, and I'm excited to be spending this evening with all of you. Thank you for sharing your time and energy and joining Walden University's Talks for Good. If you haven't already, let us know in the chat who's here, where you're joining from, and your role or connection to education. Right now, we find ourselves living in a historic moment, grappling with grief, loss, challenges, and the unknown, amplified by a national and global pandemic. The moment is real and unsettling for many. And yet, here we are, a community of purpose-driven minds and hearts, desiring to learn, connect, and make a collective impact for the greater good. As you engage in tonight's discussion, I encourage you to remember loved ones, students, teachers, families, and communities that aren't here in the space with us, but fortify your hope and give you strength and inspiration. Tonight, the discussion will focus on historical implications that affect equity in education, allowing us to better understand the present state of education, discussed in greater detail during the next Talk for Good in June, and vision toward the future, discussed in the last talk of the series in July. In light of recent racially charged tragedies, the entire evening will center around the panel discussion and your questions for the panelists. There will be no breakout groups as previously planned. In order to dissect equity in education, we must examine the structures of inequity baked into the foundation of the United States of America and its devastating effect. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. Discussions on race, racism, and inequity inherently produce discomfort. Your discomfort, our discomfort, can be productive and is necessary to better understand self, others, systemic racism, and oppressive ideologies. Tonight, I'm asking all of us to ground ourselves in 4 agreements for courageous conversations about race, created by Glenn Singleton, president and founder of Pacific Educational Group, which are: 1, stay engaged. Remain present in the conversation via chats, polls, and beyond tonight's discussion. 2, experience discomfort. Lean into discomfort with curiosity to help you unpack your reactions. 3, speak your truth respectfully and authentically. All lived experiences and identities are valued and welcomed in this space. Therefore, any harmful or violent language, symbols, and displays will not be tolerated, and doing so will lead to immediate removal from the session. And 4, accept and expect non-closure. Hang out in uncertainty, y'all. You will have more questions than answers. Equity is a process, not a product. All of us will have an opportunity to lean into these agreements during the rich panel discussion with our incredible panelists. Please share your curiosities and reactions and questions for the panelists in the chat. You'll also have the opportunity to weigh in on poll questions similar to what the panelists are asked. Closed captioning is available for use on the Zoom toolbar. And without further ado, allow me to introduce our dynamic panel. Dr. Joy Angela DeGruy is a researcher, educator, social worker, and expert on race relations and historical trauma. Her research focuses on the intersection of racism, trauma, violence, and American chattel slavery. Dr. DeGruy has more than 30 years of practical experience in social work and conducts workshops and training on intergenerational historical trauma, mental health, social justice improvement strategies, and evidence-based model development. For more than 2 decades, she served as an assistant professor at Portland State University School of Social Work and is now president and CEO of Joy DeGruy Publications, Inc. Welcome, Dr. Joy. Justice Alan Paige became the first African American to serve on the Minnesota Supreme Court from 1993 to 2015, until he reached the mandatory retirement age of 70. While earning his law degree, Justice Paige had a successful career playing in the National Football League for the Minnesota Vikings and Chicago Bears. He was voted to 9 consecutive Pro Bowls, earned All-Pro honors 6 times, and was named the NFL's most valuable player. In 1988, Justice Paige was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Also in 1988, Justice Paige and his wife, Diane, founded the Paige Education Foundation, which assists students of color in their pursuit of post-secondary education. To date, the foundation has awarded over $15 million in grants to 7,000 students. In November 2018, Justice Paige received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Welcome, Justice Paige.
Thank you.
Dr. Daryl Williams is a former assistant superintendent for Prince George's County Public Schools and currently serves as a senior education equity specialist with the Center for Education Equity at MAEC. He provides technical assistance and professional development training to schools and school districts to ensure students are given access to an equitable education regardless of race, gender, national origin, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, or religious beliefs. His extensive background in education includes positions as a classroom teacher, school administrator, director of Title I federal programs, state specialist with the Maryland State Department of Education, and education coordinator with the Maryland Department of Social Services. Daryl Williams serves as senior education equity specialist with the Center for Education and Equity at MAEC. Welcome, Dr. Williams.
Good evening. Thank you.
And serving as audience ambassador to share your questions for the panel and your sentiments and reactions is Molly Raymond, Associate Director of the Center for Social Change at Walden. The center is committed to empowering change makers, building community, and elevating social change outcomes across the university, and is co-sponsoring this event. Molly's background is in community social work with experience in youth programming in public schools and nonprofit organizations, and is co-founder of a youth social justice organization. She has experience in community organizing and diversity, equity, and inclusion facilitation, and is a PhD candidate in public policy and administration. She brings passion and humility to discussing equity in education and believes in the importance of honoring our shared history as we work toward a more just future. Welcome, Molly. Dr. Joy, Dr. Williams, and Justice Paige, let's begin. Dr. Williams, how can we use history as a lens to examine equity in education?
Thank you very much for that excellent question. One of the things we really need to do is focus back on the history of education, education law, education policy, see how it helped frame the current structure of our education systems today. So when we think about Brown versus the Board of Education, which its design was to ensure the elimination of racial segregation, it was embedded within this law to address issues around excellence and equity and equality. And somehow we found that we're still talking about equity almost 70 years later. And perhaps that's because we had too many expectations of Brown. And so to have those expectations, we've got to look back in order to point the direction forward. We're in an environment with COVID-19. We're seeing every day that Black men and men of color are being gunned down. And yet this is still a byproduct of many systems that impact our educational systems. And so we have not dealt strongly enough with issues of racism, with inequities around sexism, around homophobia, and other kinds of issues that create these divides between people. And our structures are in place to keep these kinds of efforts on the forefront. And so when we think about equity, are we ready to have that serious conversation about the inequities that exist in our systems and that are also permeated and reflected in our school systems? I hope tonight we are challenging everyone to take not just a serious look at inequities in education, but to decide it's time to do something about it.
Dr. Joy, same question.
Thank you, first of all, and thank you for allowing me to be on a panel with such esteemed colleagues. So first of all, I think what shows up for me is the fact that we need to take a look at history in order to frame, in order to give context to why we're having this conversation at all. Okay, so the reason why we're having to have this conversation is actually folded in very, very deeply within the history of this country, not the least of which for people of African descent started with us not even being perceived as fully human. Moving into law, as was stated before, what does educational law look like? What has it looked like? Well, if you're going to start somewhere, you've got to start where for 339 years we were not allowed to be educated at all. We have to look at the impact of Jim Crow. We have to look at the impact of access. We have to look at the impact of a system that works perfectly to produce the results that we're getting. So again, for me, it doesn't even seem rational to even begin a discussion about where we need to go until we understand how we arrived at where we are and what are the systems and structures that have maintained the current system of inequity that is producing the gaps in so many parts of our community. Again, we didn't, we're not just looking at education. Folks didn't, just show up in the classroom. We have to look at what is the history of even the communities that we're talking about. What are the histories as it relates to folks even understanding what's in front of them? So yeah, I think that looking at history as a lens, starting with we the people of the United States in order to form a more perfect union, and understanding that the we did not include most.
Thank you. Justice Paige, how can we use history as a lens to examine equity in education?
Well, I think when you think about where we are today, you have to look at what we're grounded in. And it seems to me that what we are confronted with is essentially the present effects of what went on before. The present effects, if you will, of past discrimination. The present effects of a system that, as Dr. Joy pointed out, didn't count people who look like me as a whole person. Indeed, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution still contains the words which referred to 3/5 of a person. Now, granted, subsequent amendments override that position, those words, but nonetheless, we are still rooted in a country that started off leaving a good majority of us behind. And so until we can pull apart and address the sort of the core of who we are as a country, I think we are doomed to continue down the road that we are on today.
Thank you. The reoccurring theme and the responses from all three of you tilted towards an ideology, a concept of being about groups of people that are ascribed inferior characteristics from a group that is more dominant, that ascribes superior characteristics to themselves, and how that ideology then gets embedded in institutions and laws and practices and policies, and how that continues to perpetuate inequity throughout institutions, throughout systems, and in particular, education. Dr. Williams, you mentioned Brown versus Board of Education. So the year is 1952. 5 court cases seeking educational equity come before the Supreme Court. The court combines them into a single case under the name Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. Chief attorney for the plaintiffs, Thurgood Marshall, argued the unified cases, and in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Brown versus Board of Education that separate but equal was unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The decision held a magnifying glass to opportunity inequity in public education. Some states and localities began earnest efforts to integrate. However, the promise of school integration was met with waves of violent backlash and resistance. As a result of the decision, more than 30,000 Black teachers and administrators were fired, impacting the decline of Black educators and principals in public education to this very day. My question for the panel, starting with you, Dr. Joy, 66 years after the ruling, has Brown versus Board of Education delivered on its promise of integrated schools, and why or why not?
Okay, so let's just start with the fact that separate and equal never happened. Okay, we had separate, but it was never equal. Okay, so we have some fundamental misunderstandings that suggest this kind of almost like a fairy tale of a level playing field, that somehow we all started at the same level. So even prior to Brown, we have a system that suggested separate but equal. It continues to be separate right now. And if anybody's confused about that, if I were to ask anyone paying attention right now, wherever you live, do you know where the Black community is? do you know where the Black people are? Not only do you know where the Black people are, do you know where the poor Black people are? Do you know? And so what this, again, it begs the question. Of course, Brown could not fulfill itself. Not a single law prior to that fulfilled, we didn't get the 40 acres and a mule. Okay, so from a very realistic vantage point, no, Brown didn't do it. Brown was certainly that move in the right direction, hence the fact that we're still having this conversation, largely blaming the people, breaking people's legs and then complaining that they limp, right? So we have this kind of revisionist history, which suggests for a lot of people right now are thinking, yeah, playing field is leveled. You had a Black president, all good. Okay, no, it's not all good, because we still have, for example, social determinants, right? Social determinants that not only from my actual physical health, life expectancy, but where I am in the world, where I can go to school, if there is a school near me, if I can even get to that school. So all of these things you see are combined. This is the intersectionality of class, looking at the issues of poverty. So no, it didn't cut it, but I'm not surprised that it didn't. None of the laws prior to that cut it. None of them actually fulfilled what they said they do.
Justice Paige, your thoughts?
I would just say that it's clear that segregated schools still exist today. I would note that the one difference, and I think a significant difference, is that those segregated schools, that segregation is not state-sponsored. It may be state-permitted, but it is not state-sponsored. And whatever we think about the long-term impact of Brown, it seems to me that sounding the death knell for Plessy versus Ferguson was vitally important and very significant. Indeed, it sounded the death knell, Brown did, for state-sponsored segregation beyond the sphere of education, in housing, in transportation, in commerce. Do we still have problems in all those areas? Certainly, and significant ones. But Brown was the first step. I think the problem there is twofold. One, Brown was decided, and I have to tell you, Brown had a significant impact on me. I was 8 years old when Brown was decided, and I can still remember reading newspaper articles about that decision. And I grew up in Ohio, where the segregation wasn't state-sponsored, but yet that case gave me a sense of hope, a hope that things could be better. They're not certainly where we want them to be today, and part of that is because along the way we have, to some degree, dropped the ball. We got the Brown decision, and we haven't been as forceful, as strategic, in ensuring that schools were integrated, that quality education was available to all children, no matter where they come from, whether they're from the inner city or from the rural areas of our country. And so, and I hate to admit it, I got so focused on the first part of my answer, I've lost track of that second point I was going to make. But Brown created the opportunity. We just haven't made sure that it is fulfilled. And that is not to suggest that, think about Little Rock, think about
You're good, Justice Paige. Think about Little Rock.
Little Rock, I was 12 years old then, and what we as a nation allowed to happen there is beyond my ability to appreciate, to understand. Yet we allowed it to happen.
And Justice Paige, when you say we and we dropped the ball, what collective we are you referring to?
I'm talking about the United States of America and all of us who inhabit this country. I'm not talking about any specific group. I'm talking about all of us. Because the problem, as it relates to education, as it relates to race generally, isn't a problem for Black people or brown people or Native American people. It's a problem for all of us. And so when I say we, I am speaking about everybody.
A collective responsibility.
Collective responsibility.
Thank you. Dr. Williams, has Brown delivered on its promise? Why or why not?
I would add that Brown has not delivered, and one of the things that really is resonating with me right now is to feel the emotions from Justice Paige and the lived experiences of what Brown meant to him. I was 8 years old also. Probably had a very different kind of experience where Brown was not something that I was that exposed to as a child. But as I've grown older, I've begun to understand just what the foundational principle of Brown was intended to provide. It was intended to deal with racial segregation in public education. However, it did not create a national or even a racial, in my view, movement to put in place those kinds of remedies that needed to be looked at. And so I tend to look at this from a very multi view, where I look at education law. And so we had Brown 1 and 2. Brown 1 established that it was unconstitutional to have separate but equal. Brown 2 was designed to accelerate schools that refused to integrate, as Dr. Joy spoke of. But I think too of some of the communities that I've lived in as an adult and some of the school systems that I've worked in, and I think about my own district here, Prince George's County, and the impact of federal law, and I think about Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which was that federal case to deal with busing. as a way of overcoming racial segregation. I think particularly about Vaughn versus the Board of Education, Prince George's County, U.S. Supreme Court case where there were illegal practices of segregation to avoid desegregation. And we're still talking about some of these same kinds of issues today that have not been remedied. In addition to that, we have federal education policy legislation that was supposed to fill the gaps of what Brown was not able to do on its own as a Supreme Court decision. So we had the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1964, providing funding for schools and districts. That was the centerpiece of public education. And we've had numerous iterations and reauthorizations of ESEA. But despite these numerous reauthorizations, despite the fact that we've had so many different types of federal legislation, from Improving American Schools Act, 1994, Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act. We had No Child Left Behind, first iteration, American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. We had the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind under President Barack Obama. We had ESEA reauthorization in 2015. We had Common Core. We now have ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act. And still, we talk about equity and inequity and race in education. So in and of itself, Brown did not deliver. And I agree with Justice Paige that we dropped the ball because some remedies were put in place, but I don't believe that we really engaged in what these remedies were intended to do. And in some cases, we were blindsided by some of these remedies, because in 2020, we still talk about inequities. We still talk about racial gaps. We still talk about underachievement. We still talk about polarization between groups. And so for me, we've got a long way to go in order to fulfill any promises that Brown may have intended to address.
Thank you. So it sounds like the general consensus amongst the panel is that Brown has not delivered on its promise of integrating schools. I took a quick glance at the poll and saw that the audience predominantly thinks it requires considering multiple other areas, contributing factors, housing law, school funding, segregation. So then my question is, if Brown has not delivered on its promise, because alone it could not, what is the collective responsibility of the nation at every level, from a local level, from a state level, from a school district level, from a community level?
Can I just jump in and say, one of the problems here is that, and again, when I say we, I'm using the collective we, but we should not be surprised that our schools are segregated, when our communities are segregated, when our workplaces are segregated. We should not be surprised that our schools are. And it seems to me that that's on each and every one of us as individuals. Until we stop segregating ourselves, I think it's going to be a tremendous challenge, which takes me back to the discussion of, why is the history important? Because in a sense, the system of education that we have and the systems of criminal justice that we have being grounded in the past, in a system that was rooted in slavery, until we can sort of pull that apart and really start fresh, I think we're going to have some difficult times. And not to suggest that sort of unwinding all of that is easy. Indeed, I'm sure there are people would say, well, wait a minute, I wasn't responsible for that. I wasn't here. I didn't do that. And all of that is true. I don't believe that. You may not believe what went on was right. But the fact is that for those who benefit from that system, until we can change the system, because this is a systemic problem, until we can change the system, at some level, we're we're moving the deck chairs on the Titanic.
I'm sorry, Justice Paige. I just wanted to piggyback on something that you said, because I believe we, United States of America, embraces a system that enjoys separatism. Okay, so we have separation of church and state. We have separation of levels of government, local, state, federal. We have all of these structures that allow for separation, and yet we cannot collectively come together to deal with the issues of racism and race, because we've got too many segregated pieces that say, well, that's not my responsibility, that's a state's right. Or, the federal government hasn't provided enough funding, Master hasn't given us enough money to deal with the problem. And everybody's got their hands out because we think somebody's supposed to give us something. And we're not taking collective responsibility to break down a dangerous structure called the United States of America and its Constitution for some things that it allows to remain separate and segregated. It's embedded within the fabric of the Constitution.
So I wanted to jump in here. I think that there is a bit of mythology around the idea that, all things being equal, all things aren't equal. Okay, so I don't look at, for example, where people find themselves collectively as a country. Most certainly, we're accountable as a country. But when you start looking at the governed versus the governors, when we start looking, let's look at something like the GI Bill, for example. And everybody knows that the GI Bill was designed for veterans. And so it's a federal program. They said, yes, we think it's absolutely important, but also written, and you can find some of this information in The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, but understanding that here we have this GI Bill, which really gave people footing in this country, gave them the body of wealth to build wealth, right? And so what the federal government said, which of course, this is available to all veterans, but was it available to all veterans? Well, from a federal vantage point, yes, but also written into federal law at the exact same time it is it's not considered moral for white people to have to live in proximity of white people. Also written in was that whole idea that it's not even considered moral for white people to have to live in proximity of Black people. So then what the federal government did was left it to the states to make that call. And the states were segregated. And so guess who got the GI Bill and who didn't? Yet there's this mythology that, wow, God, you could have, pulled yourselves up from your bootstraps. Well, you maybe could have if you had bootstraps. But I think there is this kind of sense that, if you just really try a little harder. And what we have to appreciate is, and here's how I look at it. There's a huge dam, okay? And this dam, we start looking at public education, Brown versus the Board of Education, whatever you want to look at, there's this huge dam and it's got cracks in it. And all the water is coming out. And then we're putting Band-Aids on it. People are putting their fingers and toes trying to hold back the water. Now, here's what I believe. Something's wrong with the dam. So instead of trying to hold back the water and let's, try to manage it, piecemeal it, it's broken and it's going to fall down. Let's just make certain we have a steel dam situated for when the water comes down, because come down it will. And so there's this idea that you can fix the system. The system is working perfectly. It was never designed to be inclusive. And this major, wonderful conversation we're having wasn't designed for that. In every single place in the United States, in every major institution in the United States, there is a clause. And that clause does not benefit people of color, poor people, women. Do the math. Unless you were a white, wealthy landowner, the Constitution didn't even include you. A white male landowner, wealthy, that's who it included. And of course, we get our wits about ourselves and we have, all our feelings that are happening right now. But I am in these communities. I'm in communities where people are working 16 hours and they're trying to figure out how to make ends meet. They did not redline their community. They don't even know why they're there. But it started with redlining, right? And then we said, well, let's just take a look at a current situation with coronavirus. And with the coronavirus, we know disproportionately Black people are dying. Well, that's no surprise. We were disproportionately dying before that. And the only pre-existing problem was racism. That one was the one that was there. So when we start looking at COVID, one of the things the school districts around the country started doing, they said, you know what? We're sheltered at home. We got to get Chromebooks to every student. In certain school districts, they were handing out a Chromebook a minute. And then we thought about it. And we started looking at where the Chromebooks were going. And some of those places where Chromebooks were going for students to be able to engage with their teachers and learn, they didn't have the internet. Okay, so did everybody have access? Well, we gave them a Chromebook. Again, I think we have to do the deep dive here. And we have to be careful not to, dilute the whole picture by behaving as though everyone had equal power and capacity to make change happen. That's just not the case. And I feel strongly about that because, again, try harder. We tried harder for 339 years, paid. Nobody had to pay for us to do anything. For 339 years, people got free labor. And they believe nobody's benefited from that. My family, my people inherited debt, other people inherited wealth. And then we want to argue about privilege. Yeah, I feel some kind of way about it because I think, again, there's a mythology generally about how systems work in America and why. And if we get to that, then we can begin to have a real conversation about what the next step is, whether it's learning how to navigate within a historical and contemporary hostile environment, because I'm with that. I've done that my whole life. Or whether we're going to talk about how or why we're going to somehow fix the system a little better. I'm for starting and taking a look at, in spite of whether the system works or not, we have to do good work and we have to save the children. That's my call.
Profoundly stated. Audience, prepare your questions in the chat. We're going to go into Q&A soon. Dr. Joy, your last point, in spite of the system, we have to do better, right? In spite of the system, what's within my locus of control based on where I am, my sphere of influence? What do we do? if we aren't serving in our local government or politics or school board for whatever reason, and that's no shade, what do we do in our locale? What's in our locus of control?
I think that's such a wonderful question, because that's really where I work. What we know based on the science of improvement, here's what we know, is that if you're trying to help a child, and particularly a child of color, and you think you can pluck that child out of wherever they are, put them in a good program, everything ought to be great. Well, based upon what we know about multisystemic treatment, multisystemic approaches, you need multiple systems, which means if I want to work with the child, I've got to work with the parent. And you see, that's where people draw the line in the sand. Oh, yeah, I'm going to work with them, but I'm not, my MOU doesn't say I got to go over there and talk to those people in that environment, in that community, and that's dangerous. I'd rather just get this kid a tutor and a big brother and, hope for the best. Well, no, I don't, because what I understand based on science is that you need all those factors. Exactly what you said, Mikel, exactly what you said. I need the parents involved. I would need that community businesses involved. I need faith-based community folks involved. I need administrators. I need superintendents. I need everyone on board. But if we don't look at this from the vantage point, we say we, but we aren't working together, right? Right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. So part of what our role is, my role as an educator, is to educate people, one, so you'll do no more harm, and educate those who have been harmed to not become victims, because we've had to deal with far worse than what we're dealing with now. This too will pass. But I'm not, I can't put on the kid, those glasses, because I saw what my parents went through coming out of the South. I saw how my father was treated and my mother. And I looked at what it was like for me to go and get four degrees. I know what that's like. So when I look at people on the ground and we say, why can't you do better? I had a young woman, easily, she was 7th grade, easily genius level, this little girl. No one in her family had ever gone to college. No one. Straight A student. She said she wanted to be an engineer during, whatever one of these little groups were that they were having. It was like career day. She goes, I want to be an engineer. And she was immediately told by, again, a white businessman, a banker, oh, you have to be good at science and math. She goes, I get straight A's in science and math. Long story short, I start trying to work with her to get her in school. And the first thing I do is talk to her mother. But what I didn't know is that her mother couldn't fill out the financial aid forms. And she wasn't going to tell me because she was ashamed that she couldn't read and understand them. So I went to that house. I sat at the table and I asked every question, read every question, answered every question. And that girl is now teaching advanced math on a master's level. But we can't say, gosh, they just would, show up. There are so many layers that did not start where we're seeing them. There's so many layers. And so who's willing to do that? Well, as a parent, just obviously didn't want anything for her children. Are you following me? I mean, when we start talking about the complexity of this, then let's lean into it. Honestly, people tell you, well, hey, I'm an English teacher. I'm not a social worker. Okay, that's great. Maybe let me suggest some schools you should go to. Because let me tell you what the history of this community is and who you have to show up as to help these children and these families. So it's collective. Yeah, requires a whole lot. And we've done it before, we can do it again, but let's not pretend we don't see what's going on here. Again, I'm not going to whine and complain. I'm going to keep it moving, but I'm also not going to break somebody's leg and then complain that they limp. Not going to do that. Nor am I going to let anybody else do that. So yeah, I'm ready to roll up my sleeves. The question is everybody willing to do that, or they want to just, sign a check or check the box that they went to the diversity group? I don't know, but folks are dying. So I think it has to be, it's got to evolve beyond an intellectual conversation and become one that embraces the whole truth and look at the multi-systemic problems that are existing.
Thank you. And I hear you saying, even at the grassroots level of the village around you, families, faith-based organizations in the community, pulling together, working together. Dr. Williams?
Can I just jump in and say, it's not just enough to talk about the problem. We have to be intentional about acting on the problem. And when I say intentional, I mean teachers, people like me, people like you, people like our audience. We have to be engaged intentionally on a daily basis, working with children, working with schools, working with communities, because it's one thing to think about it. It's something else again to be intentional about acting on it. I want to use the collective we again, but as a nation, we tend to look for the easy and the simple answer, and then wonder why we keep getting the same results. We have to be willing to sit down, sort out what the best path forward is, and then intentionally take that path daily.
And Justice Paige, who was part of that task force to intentionally lay out and take that path forward? Who's part of that in your mind?
Well, it's children, quite frankly. It's students, it's teachers, it's parents. That's where it begins. It's school administrators. I mean, if the people in the education system aren't engaged on, as I say, on a daily basis, intentionally, then we've got a problem. But, I think that we all play a role, and we need to listen to and sort out what children need. We need to look at how we prepare them. And I would just say I'm a strong believer in the notion that education works best when students, teachers, and parents work together. I also think education works best and is likely to be most successful. And mind you, I'm not an educator, but I do spend a lot of time in schools and classrooms talking to children. That the process works best when we educate one school at a time, one classroom at a time, one child at a time. That, I think, is critical, that we need to focus how we educate. Indeed, that may be more important than what we educate. I mean, at the end of the day, I think what we want children to be able to do is think critically. Once they learn how to think critically, they can figure the rest of it out. But if we never teach them to think critically, then no matter what we teach them, no matter how much information they learn, they don't learn to think critically, to analyze and question and go from there, then I'm not sure what we're doing.
Thank you, Justice Paige. Your thoughts make me think a couple of things, and that is how we're preparing the adults that work with the children to think critically, to engage with community, to work across difference and diverse perspectives, across a gamut of identities. One, and I'm also holding, how do we also hold the decision-making structures accountable as well? Because if the decision-making structures are absent of diverse perspective, if there is still a hoarding of power in decision-making structures, even at the grassroots community, family, student, parent, teacher level, the system is still at play. So I think it's widening the seats at the table to come together and also have these discussions as well. Dr. Williams, what would you like to include?
I would say that, we hear this adage, it takes a village to really impact and raise children in a community. And that is very true. But one of the issues I see is that our villages are so fragmented. And so it's difficult to pull the village together when the education system and the criminal justice system and the economic system and the welfare systems and all of these systems aren't aligned to collectively look at society and how we improve society, how we improve the different structures within society, how do we ensure fairness in employment, how do we ensure that every student is exposed to a quality of educational excellence, the quality, not just as our response may have been. And unfortunately, COVID may have created just this quick response of give everybody a Chromebook, send everybody a packet of information without looking at the quality of what we're sending. And I don't want to paint the picture that educators aren't doing their job. We've got a lot of educators that are working as hard as they can under the structures they're in. And so for many, they only know what they know. They can only teach and they can only do what they have been taught to do. And so I would say that, again, we need to look at structures, this traditional mode of education, if I want to just keep it at the education level, and see that we've not moved this model to keep pace with generational changes. I mean, we've got a Generation X population right now, and we're still trying to teach them, by a lecture-based, model. The kids want access to information quick, and they can multitask, and they can work with computers and devices. And so we have not moved the learning needle, the teaching and learning needle, far enough to address the learning needs of a new population. I think we also have not dealt with teacher training. So again, we've not exposed our professionals, and professionals for me is everybody in a schoolhouse. We don't have to call them a paraprofessional, or you're working with children, so you're all professionals to me. But we've not prepared everyone to understand the learning needs of our children and how they learn differently. And then for leaders, we still have leaders that turn a blind eye, turn their backs on some of the biases and the practices that are happening in schools. We talk often about kids not having the relationships or needing relationships to help build the connections for learning. But we have a lot of kids that walk into school buildings and, some people don't speak to them, or some kids walk in the building and they get yelled at as soon as they walk in. We've got kids who may be of a different religious persuasion, and some people immediately say, take that scarf off your head, and not respecting their religious rights. Or we've got students who are LGBTQ community, and people don't want to come near them because, they're homophobic. And so we've got all of these things that are happening, and it's just, we've got to be able to break these cycles of not connecting to children and being either afraid of children or not caring about children. Because I think that's one of the places it starts. And it also then takes me to leaders, again, who have to be able to recognize that perhaps your school still practices bias and other types of discrimination in the building. So collectively, to raise a village, the village has to be connected. The village has to see that it is connected by something. Generally, that has been schools. But we have to be able to help people move beyond a model that has not worked for a lot of children. And my fear, and I'll close it with this, in this environment of COVID, my fear is that while we talk about things like a new normal, we're not going to go back to a new normal because people want to go back to what's comfortable and convenient, business as usual. And I think that there is a movement to let's get back to being normal, because as bad as normal was, I don't have the resources, the energy, the courage, the support, the everything to create a new normal because it's so different from my lived experience.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Molly, let's hear from the audience. Let's get the audience questions and reactions.
Yeah.
Panel.
Yeah, thank you so much, panel. Really, really insightful comments, and you've given a lot for our audience to think about. And I would just like to thank the audience publicly for their engagement on chat. There's been a lot of really great conversation and input and back and forth conversation, so it feels like a community there. It's interesting. There's been, I think it started with this comment that Steve actually made, which is, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, but no, we have to keep going. And I think we're all sort of feeling that. And I just want to bring that into the room, that we're just sort of feeling like we know we need resilience, but it's hard. So thank you all for showing up. And there has been, Dr. Williams, what you mentioned about the village is broken. There's a lot, I mean, that really struck a chord with our audience. There's been a lot of people saying like, yes, I didn't even really think about it that way. But the importance of having shared values within that village, and the importance of them being informed and supportive and inclusive, which are all challenging, components to manage in a village. And, working through the different levels of responsibility. And just as Paige was talking about, it's all of us and how all of us work together. So there, I do want to bring out a comment. Several folks have brought up, we want to be thoughtful and inclusive of our Native American community and Indigenous people of our lands. And so just want to put that into the room. I do have several questions, but, just other sort of comments around the responsibility of parents, and what about trauma? How does trauma inform our community and our parents and the students, and are our teachers trauma informed? The role of the systems. I mean, I won't go on, but people are doing a lovely job of sort of dissecting the different areas and challenges that they see and have experienced.
Thank you. Could you share a question or two for us,
Yeah.
Molly? Thank you.
So let's start with how can educators change student behavior regarding racism and sexism when they do not have the same support at home? Parents push back when sex ed is recommended. How can we as educators get parents to support racial education if it were to be recommended? And that's to anybody who's willing to share.
Can I start there? And I'm looking at my colleague, Dr. Joy, because I know she's ready to jump on that. So let me just throw a little nugget in there to give her something to feed on, and then she can take it, she can take it. So I would say that in dealing with children's behavior and trying to help students understand race and the issues around racism, part of it has to start with an acknowledgement by adults of what are your views and your attitudes around people who are different from you are. And so you have to be able to acknowledge and recognize yourself. We can try to help young people to understand racial differences, but it's a little bit counterproductive if I have a bias, implicit, explicit, about students of color. And so I may, promote or want to promote a way where we're talking about working together, the kumbaya kind of a approach. But if my inner deep feelings are not in sync with what I'm trying to promote and trying to build with students, then I'm doing just as much harm, because I may be in a classroom and decide, well, black boy over there who needs some extra nurturing to be engaged, I'm not going to engage him. I'm not going to, and he may not be a disruptive problem. See, I think that's another fallacy we have. We think because kids, might be disruptive in the classroom, that they're the ones. You got those silent kids who are dealing with so much in their life experiences, and they may be quiet in the classroom, but you got this bias. I have this bias, and I don't even recognize he's hurting. And so I don't reach out to nurture this child because of my implicit thoughts about those kinds of children. And I do just as much harm to that child as I'm doing to the one I'm always singling out because maybe he didn't have a pencil that day and I'm throwing him out of class, rather than recognizing there ain't paper or pencil in his house. And so, I just caution to, if we don't look at ourselves first in our feelings about children, we're going to miss the boat in what we're trying to give children to look at with each other. Dr. Joe, I want to turn that over to you. I know you, my sister.
Okay, you said a whole lot there. You said a whole lot. Again, most of my work, I work with school districts. I work with schools. I've taught elementary, middle, high school, junior college, university. And I've worked with the kids everybody throws away. They sent to my classroom every child they didn't want in there. But the question originally was asked, how do we begin to deal and have these conversations of race when this is not supported at home? What I love about children are phenomenal and they're resilient. And just one caring adult can make the difference. My high school guidance counselor told me I wasn't college material. Middle-aged white woman told me that. You're not college material. Joy, you needn't even try. Well, 4 degrees later, I'm just sad that she didn't live long enough for me to go back to that school and blow her hair back. But it wasn't so much me that I was concerned about, because my family, even though my father went to the 6th grade and my mother had a scholarship for college and raised a family instead, I grew up in an environment that said, you're going to go to college. That was just something. But how about all of those people that she was the guidance counselor for that she looked across and just assumed that they weren't capable? It hurt my heart how many folks did not have maybe a family where there were people who could help them navigate that. But I wanted to point folks to, it's an Anderson Cooper broadcast, and it's called Through a Child's Eyes. And this I found was fascinating. They looked at, hundreds and hundreds of children. And they showed them a picture. And the picture is of a swing, a child standing next to the swing, and a child with their legs folded sitting in front of the swing. They showed this picture to children from, I want to say from 4 to maybe 11 years old. And they asked them what they were seeing. If the child that was standing next to the child, next to the swing was Black, and the child that was on the floor on the ground with their legs folded was white, 70% of white children said that Black kid pushed him off the swing. 70%. Almost the same number of Black children and children of color said he's waiting his turn, he's getting ready to help that kid up. So I want to give you the perspective. This is hundreds and hundreds of, children across the country. And so then they began to interview the children. So they interviewed this little 4-year-old boy. I'll never forget this little 4-year-old boy. And they asked him questions like, could you play with the child standing next to the swing? And the little boy said, no. He said, why? He said, because he's Black. He says, well, why don't you think you can play with him? And he said, did someone tell you that? No. Why do you think you can't play with him? Because, when I go home, I've never seen anyone look like that. My parents haven't invited anyone that looks like him. So the child's assumption is, you all aren't demonstrating that this person's okay, even though you might be saying that to me. That's not what I'm seeing. And again, you have children of color that are consistently harmed in these situations because of that perception. But what I do love is working with children, because children can work it out, right? They can figure a way how to deal with it, but still they're fragile and they still get harmed. And so the answer then becomes, how can I shore up this child, not only just child, but the family? So let me give you a case, a situation, so you can understand what I'm talking about, because we want to help. I hear everybody here, we're talking about the village, and I have a special place in the village. I recognize that I'm a consultant to the village. I live in the village. There's a lot of things about the village that Dr. Joy is accessible to her community. And so what happens is, real story, I'll tell you a real story, school district, achievement gap, school, kids of color aren't doing as well as the white kids. Only the difference now is Dr. Joy's grandchildren are in this school. So I actually developed a 10-week course for parents, a parent class, graduate level. And I don't care if we need to read every question to you. I take parents through that 10 weeks. I take schools through the 10 weeks, administrators, and anyone you put in front of me, because I have skin in the game. My grandkids are there. We didn't choose a school that was so great that you have no problems, or that you have a child of color that's isolated, that's constantly the only one. We didn't want to do that to the grandkids. We wanted to wrap our arms around the local school that wasn't the worst, wasn't the best, somewhere in the middle, and embrace that school. So the first thing that happened was my daughter and her friends, all of whom are, graduate degrees, goes to the principal of the school and says, we want to help the school, and we want to help with the fact that there seems to be some problems, achievement, a lot of issues. Principal's response, trust me, I'm going to get to the answer here. So the principal said the problem is, because he's getting responses from the teachers, 92% of whom are white, and he says, they say that the Black parents, and the Latinx parents, they don't show up to, parent-teacher conferences. They're not showing up to, back to school night. So my daughter said, so what you've just done is you've blamed the people you actually are trying to, the users of the system that you really want to be participants. You've blamed them. One, the answer is also locked in your blaming. They just need to come and show up. It's their fault and they need to show up. So the principal asked my daughter, well, how would you say it? She said, well, you're not getting participation of all of our parents in back to school night or parent teacher conferences. Then you can go to the user, the people you want to come. And my daughter did that. So she went to Black parents, created something called Black Parent Night, and ended up with 95% parental involvement of parents of color, just by creating a space where they felt welcomed in it. So the Black mother, she asked the Black mother, why do you think a parent may not come to the school? She goes, I don't know. I just don't have enough time, though. I just don't have enough. Oh, so if you had enough time. Well, I don't have, childcare. Oh, so if you had childcare. Oh, yeah. And, sometimes I don't have transportation. Okay, so if you have transportation, time, childcare, silence. Black mother says, I've never felt welcomed in that school. What's the real problem? right? So the issue here is you haven't asked her. So then my daughter, this is data, okay? It's data. From empathy, it's data. And so the mother, she goes, well, tell me about a time when you did feel welcome. Well, when people spoke to me when I walked in. When people didn't just tell me my kid was doing poorly. Suddenly, the principal attaches to the performance review, engaging with the families. How soon did you engage with the families? Long story short, everybody's on board, teachers, principal, parents, close the achievement gap 18 points. When we start talking about coming together, we have to lean into the hard stuff, and we can't send out a survey and think we got the results. You have to show up on a different level. You have to do something different. Children learn differently, so do parents learn differently, based on how you were communicating with them. They didn't know how to communicate with families of color and simply did not. And instead said, well, we didn't hear from them because we wrote a note, impersonal note. Not the way you're going to get that reception. It doesn't take rocket science. It requires that we engage the very people we're talking about, because we don't know what people want and need. And most of the time, you can't fix people. People fix themselves. So I'm saying what goes a long way is showing up where they are and listening, empathetically listening, not sending a survey, not standing back and talking about all the degrees you have and what a good person you are. It's about saying, what is it you want? How did that feel for you? What would you have hoped would have happened? What would you tell someone else that was experiencing that? That's empathy. It's just simply empathy. And we were able to get more responses, more literal, accurate information to now begin a program, and not to just put one in there and say, because we're smart and it worked over in, well, Nebraska. Okay, let's figure out what might work for the local context. That's what I'm talking about. That's real work, right? Now, again, if you have a community, if you have a village, you don't have to worry about being everything because you have relationships with the village. And once you have relationships with the village, there's nothing you can't do. But how many of us want a relationship with the village? That's the question. Kids are fine. We just need to show up for them.
Thank you, Dr. Joy and Dr. Williams. What I'm left with from that response is, how do you create with and not create for, including the voices, designing with and not designing for, excluding those that your policy, your practice, your curriculum is going to directly impact. Looking at the time, Molly, let's do one more question. Justice Paige, this question will be for you to respond to, and then we'll have some closing words from the panel.
Sure. I think there are a lot of questions that are seeking answers. And the good news for our audience is that this is the first of 3 conversations. So while I think we're all eager to hear kind of what can we do in the moment, I think that one of those questions is the issue of divisiveness. And so if anybody'd like to comment on something that we can do in the immediate future as members of Walden community, if you have something that you'd like to speak on. Otherwise, LaShonda had this really poignant question that I'd like to bring to us to do as well. How do we peel back the layers to reach the core and evolve as a country and in our community to understand the division and the anger among groups who do not understand nor desire to step outside of their comfort zone to discuss racism?
I think the key to that is meeting people where they are and understanding that issues and discussions of race are terribly uncomfortable and terribly difficult. Everybody's afraid that somebody's going to call them a racist or view them as racist. We have to figure out how we have those conversations in an open way and have the those difficult and challenging discussions. I mean, I don't really know how we do it otherwise. We have to recognize that we all have a part in this. You know, the fact is that we all have our biases, that we are all subject to our own prejudices and our own views. We have to sort of step away from our stereotypical views of other people and talk to them as people. We have to recognize that the conventional wisdom that we want to live in a colorblind society does not mean that we can continue to live in a society that is blind to discrimination. We have to understand and try to understand, try to get to know the people that we're having the conversation with. And as I said before, I think it's critical that we stop segregating ourselves. I mean, as long as we continue to do that, issues of race, I fear, will never be addressed and resolved.
Thank you, Justice Paige. And audience, I feel you, I hear you. I ask you to lean into agreement number 4, expect and accept non-closure. Hang out in uncertainty. I said you will have more questions than you have answers. We're going to stay in the diagnosis across the series. To the panelists, as concise as you can be, leave us with a word of encouragement and wisdom on our collective journey towards equity in education.
Well, I'll jump in. You know, one of the things I've had the good fortune to be involved in is an effort here in Minnesota to change the Minnesota Constitution, to put children first so that their voices get heard. And I think when we put children first, as opposed to the adult considerations, I think good things will happen. I've also had the good fortune of having a middle school named to some degree in my honor, Justice Paige Middle School. That school got its name because the students felt that the person that was named after originally didn't stand for their values. And so they took it upon themselves and successfully had the school's name changed. And they didn't name it Allen Page Middle School. They named it Justice Page Middle School because that's what they were interested in. That was their value, justice. And I like to think that at the end of the day, justice will prevail.
Thank you. Dr. Joy.
So let me just say this, that, I've spent the better part of my life working with this issue. It's not new to me. And I don't have the privilege to not deal with it because I live in this skin and I have profound love for all communities. I believe fundamentally that humanity is one. Matter of fact, scientists have proven that we're 99.99% the same as human beings. So there's no biological race. But racism is real. That is a real thing. And I don't give a nickel's worth of time to anyone who just really, saying I can't, I won't, you hurt my feelings. I'm going to go, ooh, look at the time. Do what you have to do. But I am dealing with folks that are dying. I'm dealing with folks where we can't have the 101 conversation. I don't have time for it. I'm not saying it's not an important position. I think everyone needs Classroom 101 to begin this conversation on race, to begin to have these broader conversations. I think it's really important. But for some folks, it's life and death. And for some folks, they walk in the room at the 600 level. And so that's the problem with any of these kinds of things, is we're having conversations as though everybody enters this conversation at the same level. We don't, and that's okay. But we all have to enter it. And so for me, I guess what I would say as an encouragement is I believe that truthfulness is a foundation of all human virtue. I don't think if you don't tell the truth, you can't be well on any level. So I think we have to start telling the truth. And I think we have to also be willing, again, to feel uncomfortable and understand that that's that process of growth. And what's at stake are the children. Now, I write evidence-based models. And evidence-based model, they work. In other words, they actually work. And I know they work, but they're all based on us agreeing upon one fundamental truth. We don't have to agree on everything. You don't have to, join my religion. You don't have to do any of that. But what we have to agree is that all of us have the right to be treated with respect and dignity. I did not earn that. I was born deserving it. And so I believe that if we can believe in that fundamental premise that every human being was born with the right to be treated with respect and dignity, then we can hear their voices. Then we can be a village. Then we can engage in this conversation beyond something that is cerebral and become something structural that is going to help us all. And I agree with justice. I really do agree with you that I believe that the purpose of justice is for the appearance of unity amongst men. I believe that. And you cannot have one without the other.
Thank you. Dr. Williams, your word. I'm also looking at time. It is exactly 8:30. We're going to go over to hear your words of encouragement. We thank everyone for joining us if you have to go. But Dr. Williams, your words of encouragement for a collective journey.
Thank you. And I'll try to be short. I'm encouraged just by the mere fact that we're having this conversation. And sometimes we get into a point where we only have conversations. But I'm also looking at people like myself, and no disrespect to Dr. Joy and Justice Paige, when I say we're all in the same age group, that's the point. And so we need people who are of a new generation to be willing to take on the mantle of this fight for justice, this fight for equality and equity, because this is a societal problem. We as people of color felt the impacts of racism the hardest, but racism is impacting everybody. Because if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And so I'm encouraged when I see movements on some levels like Black Lives Matter, because it reminds me of the Civil Rights Movement. And I'm encouraged when I see people of all races and colors participating in social justice. When I see people of all colors participating in wanting to change the way this world and this country is. And so I challenge and encourage those who are younger than Justice Paige and Dr. Joy and myself, have the courage to grab that mantle, because the survival of this society really is in your hands, because we are aging out. And many of us have fought hard and we don't have that energy to keep fighting. But the fight isn't going away. So let's be a village in spite of how we look. Thank you.
Thank you to this incredible panel for expanding our minds and our hearts and discussing the issues at the root level and at the real level. Much appreciated. To follow up with our panelists and the work that they're doing, their websites are here. Thank you to the Walden team and the Soul Pancake team for bringing this event to life. Stay tuned for the upcoming Talk for Good, The Now Effect on Equity in Education at the end of June. And for more information on Walden University, you can go to waldenu.edu. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Thank you for sharing your light. Take care.